Sarah Martinez stepped off the military transport truck at Camp Pendleton, her worn duffel bag slung over her shoulder. The California sun beat down on the sprawling Marine base as she took her first look around. At 32, she was older than most of the Marines she saw jogging past in formation. Her dark hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail, and she wore civilian clothes that made her blend into the background. The transition from Navy SEAL to civilian contractor wasn't something she had planned. After 12 years of service, including 3 deployments in Afghanistan and 2 in Iraq, Sarah had decided it was time to step back from active duty. But the military skills she had spent over a decade perfecting weren't easy to leave behind. When the opportunity came to work as a marksmanship instructor for Marine recruits, it seemed like the perfect way to stay connected to the service while building a new life. Staff Sergeant Mike Rodriguez was waiting for her at the administration building. He was a typical Marine, square jaw, perfect posture, and an expression that suggested he had seen everything twice. When Sarah introduced herself, Rodriguez looked her up and down with barely concealed skepticism. "So you're the new shooting instructor," he said, not bothering to hide the doubt in his voice. "Have to say, we weren't expecting someone like you." Sarah had heard variations of this comment countless times throughout her military career. Being a woman in special operations meant constantly proving herself in a world dominated by men who often assumed she didn't belong. She had learned long ago that the best response was simply to do her job and let her skills speak for themselves. "I'm here to help improve your Marines' shooting accuracy," she replied evenly. "That's what matters." Rodriguez led her through the base, pointing out various buildings and facilities. As they walked, Sarah noticed groups of Marines stopping their conversations to watch her pass. Some looked curious, others seemed amused, and a few appeared openly skeptical. Word traveled fast on military bases, and she could already sense that her arrival was causing quite a stir. The shooting range was located on the eastern edge of the base, a sprawling complex with multiple firing lanes stretching out toward distant hills. The facility was impressive, much more modern than some of the makeshift ranges Sarah had used during her deployments overseas. Electronic target systems, covered shooting positions, and a well-maintained armory spoke to the Marine Corps' commitment to marksmanship training. "We run shooting qualifications here twice a week," Rodriguez explained as they toured the facility. "Most of our Marines can hit what they're aiming at, but we've been having issues with long-range accuracy. That's where you're supposed to come in." Sarah nodded, taking mental notes about the setup. She had spent years training in precision shooting, both as part of her SEAL training and through specialized sniper schools. The principles were the same whether you were teaching Navy personnel or Marines: breathing control, trigger discipline, proper stance, and mental focus. As they completed the tour, Rodriguez introduced her to the 3 Marine instructors she would be working with. Corporal James Washington was a soft-spoken man from Georgia who had been teaching marksmanship for 2 years. Sergeant Lisa Chun was a no-nonsense woman from California who immediately seemed more welcoming than the others. The third instructor, Corporal Tommy Blake, barely looked old enough to vote, but Rodriguez mentioned he was one of the best shots on base. "We'll start you off with tomorrow's qualification session," Rodriguez said. "About 30 Marines scheduled to test. You can observe how we run things. Then, we'll see what suggestions you might have." That evening, Sarah settled into her temporary quarters in the visiting officer's housing. The small apartment was basic but comfortable, and she spent the evening reviewing Marine Corps shooting standards and qualification requirements. She wanted to understand exactly what these Marines needed to learn and how she could best help them improve. As she prepared for bed, Sarah reflected on the challenges ahead. She had faced skepticism before, but this felt different somehow. The Marines had their own culture, their own way of doing things, and she was an outsider coming in to tell them how to shoot better. She knew that earning their respect would require more than just demonstrating her qualifications on paper. The next morning arrived gray and overcast, with a cool breeze coming in from the Pacific Ocean. Sarah arrived at the range early, wearing the civilian instructor uniform that had been provided: khaki pants, a polo shirt with the contractor company logo, and a baseball cap. She looked professional, but distinctly different from the Marines in their camouflage utilities. The Marines began arriving for their qualification session around 8 o'clock. Sarah watched as they signed in, drew their rifles from the armory, and began preparing for their tests. She could feel their eyes on her as she stood with the other instructors, and she caught fragments of conversations that were clearly about her presence. "Who's the new lady?" one young Marine asked his buddy. "Supposed to be some kind of shooting expert," came the reply. "We'll see about that." Rodriguez called the group to attention and began the standard safety briefing. Sarah listened carefully, noting how the Marines responded and what aspects of marksmanship were emphasized. The approach was systematic and by the book, which was exactly what she expected from Marine training. "Before we begin today's qualification," Rodriguez announced, "I want to introduce our new marksmanship consultant. This is Sarah Martinez. She'll be observing today and may have some suggestions for improving your shooting." A few Marines nodded politely, but Sarah could sense the underlying skepticism in the group. These were young men and women who had been trained by Marine instructors since the day they arrived at boot camp. The idea that a civilian contractor, especially a woman, might have something to teach them about shooting was clearly not sitting well with everyone. As the Marines moved to the firing line and began their qualification course, Sarah positioned herself where she could observe their techniques. What she saw was generally solid fundamentals with room for improvement in several key areas. Many of the shooters were rushing their shots, not taking full advantage of their natural respiratory pause. Others had issues with consistent cheek weld on their rifles, leading to inconsistent sight alignment. The qualification course consisted of shooting from multiple positions at various distances, starting close and moving progressively farther. Most Marines performed adequately at the shorter ranges, but as the targets moved out to 300 and 500 yards, the accuracy began to deteriorate significantly. Sarah made notes on her clipboard, documenting patterns she observed and thinking about specific techniques that might help. This was exactly the kind of analysis she had done countless times during her SEAL career, both for her own shooting and when helping to train newer team members. As the session progressed, she began to understand why the Marines were struggling with long-range accuracy. The fundamentals were mostly there, but the mental approach and advanced techniques needed for precision shooting at distance were lacking. These weren't insurmountable problems, but fixing them would require the Marines to trust her enough to listen to her suggestions. The morning session wrapped up with mixed results. About half the Marines passed their qualification, while the others would need to retest after additional practice. As the weapons were cleaned and returned to the armory, Sarah approached Rodriguez with her preliminary observations. "I can see why you're having issues at the longer ranges," she said. "The basic marksmanship is solid, but there are some advanced techniques that could make a significant difference." Rodriguez listened to her analysis with what appeared to be genuine interest. However, she noticed that several of the other Marines were watching their conversation with expressions ranging from curious to openly skeptical. "What kind of techniques?" Rodriguez asked. Sarah began explaining some of the precision shooting methods she had learned during her SEAL training, advanced breathing techniques, ways to improve natural point of aim, and mental focus strategies that could help shooters perform better under pressure. As she talked, she could see more Marines drifting closer to listen. "That all sounds good in theory," interrupted Corporal Blake, the young instructor. "But shooting on a nice, controlled range is different from the real world. These Marines need to be able to hit targets when it matters, not when shooting competitions." There was an edge to his comment that suggested he was questioning not just her techniques, but her credibility. Sarah recognized the challenge in his voice and knew that this was likely the moment that would define how the Marines viewed her going forward. "You're absolutely right," she responded calmly. "Combat shooting is different from range shooting. That's why the techniques I'm talking about focus on building skills that work under stress, not just in perfect conditions." The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of the afternoon qualification group. As Sarah watched this second group of Marines prepare for their shooting test, she realized that simply observing and offering suggestions wasn't going to be enough. These Marines needed to see concrete proof that her methods could work. The afternoon session produced similar results to the morning: decent shooting at close range, with significant drop-off in accuracy as the distances increased. Sarah continued taking notes, but she could feel the growing skepticism from some of the Marines who had been watching her all day. As the day wrapped up, Rodriguez approached her with what seemed like a genuine question. So what's your plan for actually helping these Marines improve? Observation is one thing, but how do we turn your suggestions into better shooting? Before Sarah could answer, Corporal Blake spoke up again. Maybe we should see what kind of shooter our consultant actually is before we start changing how we do things around here. The comment hung in the air for a moment, and Sarah could sense that this was more than just casual interest. Blake was essentially challenging her to prove herself, and based on the expressions of the Marines who were still hanging around, this challenge had the support of at least some of the group. Sarah looked around at the faces watching her. Some appeared curious about how she would respond. Others seemed to be enjoying the potential drama, and a few looked like they were already writing her off as just another contractor who talked a good game, but couldn't deliver. She had been in similar situations before, but never quite like this. In the SEAL teams, her skills had been proven through years of training and combat experience alongside teammates who had seen her perform under the most demanding conditions. Here, she was starting from scratch with a group that had no reason to trust her beyond her resume. "What did you have in mind?" Sarah asked, keeping her voice steady and professional. Blake gestured toward the rifle range that was now empty except for the instructors and a handful of Marines who had stayed to watch the developing confrontation. "How about you show us what SEAL shooting actually looks like? We could set up some targets and see if your techniques work as well as you say they do." Rodriguez looked uncomfortable with the direction the conversation was taking, but Sarah could tell he was also curious to see her shoot. The other instructors were watching carefully, and she realized that her response to this challenge would likely determine whether she would be able to effectively work with these Marines or if she would spend her entire contract fighting for basic credibility. Sarah nodded slowly, understanding that this moment was inevitable. "What kind of targets are you thinking about?" Blake's expression suggested he had been hoping she would back down from his challenge. When she didn't, he seemed to realize he needed to follow through on his proposal. "How about we set up targets at 100, 300, and 500 yards? Standard shooting positions. See how you do compared to our Marines' qualification scores." Sarah considered the proposal. It was clearly designed to put pressure on her, but it was also exactly the kind of demonstration that could establish her credibility if she performed well. The risk was that if she shot poorly, her effectiveness as an instructor would be severely undermined before she even got started. "That sounds reasonable," she said. "What rifle would I be using?" "Same M for that our Marines qualify with," Blake replied. "Standard issue, iron sights." Sarah nodded her agreement, and she could see Rodriguez making the decision to allow this impromptu shooting demonstration. Within a few minutes, word had spread, and more Marines began gathering to watch. What had started as a simple challenge between instructors was turning into an unofficial test that would be witnessed by a significant portion of the base's shooting community. As the targets were set up and the rifle was prepared, Sarah took a few minutes to familiarize herself with the weapon. It was similar to rifles she had used extensively during her SEAL career, but each individual weapon had its own characteristics. She checked the sight alignment, tested the trigger pull, and made sure she understood how this particular rifle would perform. The small crowd of Marines watching had grown to about 20 people, including several senior non-commissioned officers who had heard about what was happening. Sarah could feel the weight of their attention as she prepared to shoot, knowing that the next few minutes would likely define her relationship with these Marines for the duration of her contract. The stage was set for what would either be a demonstration of her capabilities or a very public failure that would undermine everything she hoped to accomplish at Camp Pendleton. Sarah could feel the tension in the air as she approached the shooting line. The group of Marines that had gathered to watch was larger now, word having spread quickly through the base about the impromptu demonstration. She could see faces in the crowd ranging from curious to skeptical to openly doubtful. A few Marines were even placing informal bets on how she would perform. Corporal Blake handed her the M4 rifle with what could only be described as a smirk. "Standard Marine Corps rifle," he said. "Same one our recruits use for qualification. Hope you're as good as your reputation says you are." Sarah accepted the weapon and spent a few moments checking it over. The rifle was well maintained, but showed signs of heavy use, as was typical for training weapons. She checked the bolt operation, examined the sights, and dry-fired it a few times to get a feel for the trigger. The weapon was perfectly serviceable, but it wasn't the precision rifle she was accustomed to using during her SEAL career. Targets are set at 100, 300, and 500 yards, Rodriguez announced, trying to maintain some semblance of official control over what had become an unofficial spectacle. Standard prone position shooting. 10 rounds at each distance. Sarah nodded and moved to the shooting mat. As she settled into position, she could hear fragments of conversation from the Marines watching. "Bet she can't even hit the 500-yard target," one voice said. "I heard SEALs are overrated anyway," came another comment. "She looks nervous," observed a third Marine. Sarah tuned out the commentary and focused on the fundamentals she had practiced thousands of times. She adjusted her position on the mat, ensuring that her natural point of aim was directed toward the first target. Her breathing slowed and became more controlled as she entered the mental state that had served her well through countless hours of precision shooting. The first target at 100 yards looked almost insultingly close after some of the extreme long-range shooting she had done during her military career. Sarah settled the rifle's front sight post on the center of the target and began her shooting sequence. Her breathing found its natural rhythm, and she waited for the pause between breaths that provided the most stable shooting platform. The first shot broke cleanly, the rifle recoiling smoothly against her shoulder. Even without spotting scope, she could tell the shot had hit near the center of the target. She worked the rifle's action, chambering another round, and settled back into position. 9 more shots followed in steady succession, each one fired with the same deliberate precision. Sarah was vaguely aware of the Marines behind her, but their presence faded into the background as she concentrated on the shooting process. This was familiar territory for her, the intersection of physical skill, mental focus, and technical precision that had made her an effective operator during her SEAL career. "Cease fire on the 100-yard line," Rodriguez called out, going downrange to check targets. A Marine jogged out to examine Sarah's target while the crowd waited in relative silence. Sarah remained in position, using the break to mentally prepare for the longer-range shooting that would follow. She knew the 300 and 500-yard targets would be significantly more challenging with iron sights, especially on a rifle that wasn't specifically set up for precision shooting. All 10 rounds in the black, the downrange Marine called back. Tight group, mostly in the center ring. Sarah heard a few murmurs of appreciation from the watching Marines, but she knew the real test was still ahead. The 100-yard shooting had been solid, but not particularly impressive by military standards. Any competent marksman should be able to achieve good results at that distance. The targets were changed out for the 300-yard phase, and Sarah adjusted her position slightly. The longer distance would require more precise sight alignment and better control of her shooting fundamentals. She could feel the Marines watching more intently now, aware that this distance would begin to separate competent shooters from truly skilled ones. Sarah studied the target through her rifle's iron sights, noting the wind conditions and light. There was a slight breeze coming from her left, not enough to significantly affect the trajectory, but something to be aware of. The overcast sky provided even lighting, which would help with sight alignment. She settled into her shooting position and began the same methodical process she had used at 100 yards. Her breathing controlled, her natural point of aim confirmed, and her mental focus narrowed to the small black circle 300 yards downrange. The first shot felt good as it broke, the rifle tracking straight back in recoil. Shot after shot, Sarah worked through her ammunition with steady precision. The longer distance required more patience between shots, allowing time for perfect sight alignment and optimal breathing control. She was dimly aware that the Marines behind her had grown quieter, their earlier casual conversation replaced by focused attention on her shooting. When the last shot was fired, Rodriguez again called for a ceasefire and sent a Marine downrange to check the target. Sarah remained in position, knowing that the most challenging portion of the demonstration was still ahead. The 500-yard target would test not just her shooting skills, but also the limits of what could be achieved with a standard military rifle and iron sights. Another solid group, the target checker reported back. 9 out of 10 in the black, 1 just outside. Still well within qualification standards. This time the murmurs from the Marines were more pronounced. Sarah could hear someone saying, "Not bad," and another voice admitting, "Better than I expected." However, She also caught Blake saying to someone nearby, "Let's see how she does at 500. That's where it gets real." The final target was positioned 500 yards downrange, a distance that would challenge even experienced marksmen using iron sights. Sarah knew this was the moment that would truly test her abilities and either establish her credibility or undermine it entirely. The margin for error at this distance was small, and any weakness in her fundamentals would be magnified significantly. As she prepared for the 500-yard shooting, Sarah noticed that the crowd of Marines had grown even larger. Word had apparently spread throughout the base, and she could see senior enlisted personnel and even a few officers who had come to observe. The informal challenge had evolved into something approaching an official demonstration. Sarah took a few extra moments to study the distant target, noting how atmospheric conditions might affect her shots. The slight crosswind she had noticed earlier would have more impact at this distance, and she would need to account for the increased bullet drop over 500 yards. Most challenging of all, the target appeared much smaller through iron sights, requiring precise sight alignment and perfect trigger control. She settled into her final shooting position, aware that every eye was focused on her performance. The weight of expectation was palpable, but Sarah had experienced pressure before. During her SEAL career, she had shot under far more stressful conditions, where missing the target could have life or death consequences. The first shot at 500 yards required extra patience. Sarah waited for the perfect moment when her sight alignment was optimal and her breathing provided maximum stability. When the shot broke, she felt confident it had been a good one, though confirmation would have to wait until someone could check the distant target. She continued through the remainder of her ammunition with the same methodical approach. Each shot was treated as an individual challenge, requiring complete focus and perfect execution of fundamentals. The Marines watching had grown completely quiet now, recognizing that they were witnessing something beyond ordinary marksmanship. When the final shot was fired, Sarah safed her rifle and remained in position while Rodriguez sent a Marine with binoculars to check the 500-yard target. The silence from the watching Marines was different now, no longer skeptical, but genuinely curious about the results. The target checker took longer this time, using binoculars to carefully examine the distant target before jogging back to report. Sarah could see him talking animatedly with Rodriguez, gesturing toward the target and shaking his head in what appeared to be disbelief. "What's the word?" Blake called out, his earlier confidence now replaced with obvious concern about the results. Rodriguez looked at his notes, then back at the distant target, as if double-checking what he had been told. When he spoke, his voice carried a note of surprise that he couldn't quite suppress. 10 shots fired, he announced. 10 hits in the black. 8 shots in the center ring, 2 in the inner ring. That's expert-level shooting at 500 yards with iron sights. The silence that followed Rodriguez's announcement was profound. Sarah could feel the shift in atmosphere as the Marines processed what they had just witnessed. The casual skepticism that had characterized their earlier attitude toward her was replaced by something approaching respect. Sarah stood up from the shooting position and began cleaning her rifle, acting as though nothing unusual had just happened. She had learned long ago that the best way to handle success was with quiet professionalism, letting the results speak for themselves rather than celebrating or calling attention to her performance. Corporal Blake approached her as she was finishing with the rifle cleaning. His earlier cockiness had been replaced by a more subdued demeanor, and Sarah could tell he was struggling with how to respond to her shooting demonstration. "That was impressive," he said, clearly uncomfortable with having to admit he had been wrong about her capabilities. "I guess SEAL training really is something different." Sarah handed him the cleaned rifle without any hint of smugness or satisfaction. "Good fundamentals work the same way for everyone," she replied. "SEALs, Marines, Army, doesn't matter. The principles are universal." As the crowd of Marines began to disperse, Sarah could hear the conversations changing. Instead of skeptical comments about the new female instructor, she heard discussions about the shooting techniques they had observed and questions about how they might improve their own marksmanship. Rodriguez approached her as she was packing up her gear. "I have to admit, I wasn't sure what to expect when they told us we were getting a civilian contractor as a shooting instructor," he said. "But after what I just saw, I think our Marines could learn a lot from you." Sarah appreciated the acknowledgement, but She knew that one good shooting demonstration, while important for establishing credibility, was only the beginning. The real challenge would be translating her individual shooting skills into effective instruction that could help the Marines improve their own performance. The demonstration was the easy part, she told Rodriguez. Now comes the hard work of actually teaching these techniques to your Marines. That's going to require them to trust the process and be willing to modify some of their existing habits. As Sarah walked back to her quarters that evening, she reflected on the day's events. The shooting demonstration had gone better than she had hoped, but she recognized that it was only the first step in what would likely be a challenging process. The Marines had seen that she could shoot, but they hadn't yet seen whether she could teach. She spent the evening reviewing her notes from observing the Marines shooting and developing a plan for the instruction sessions that would follow. The techniques that had served her well during her SEAL career would need to be adapted for a different audience with different needs and different levels of experience. The real test would come when she started working with individual Marines, helping them identify and correct the specific issues that were limiting their shooting performance. That would require not just technical knowledge, but also the ability to communicate effectively and build the kind of trust that was necessary for effective instruction. As she prepared for bed, Sarah felt cautiously optimistic about the prospects for her new role. The shooting demonstration had earned her the right to be heard, but earning the Marines' genuine respect and trust would require consistent performance over time. She was ready for that challenge, confident that the same skills that had made her successful as a SEAL would serve her well in this new role as an instructor. The next phase of her work at Camp Pendleton would determine whether she could successfully transition from individual excellence to helping others achieve their potential. The next morning brought a completely different atmosphere to the shooting range. Word of Sarah's demonstration had spread throughout Camp Pendleton overnight, and when she arrived for the morning training session, she found herself greeted with a mixture of curiosity and newfound respect from the Marines who had gathered for instruction. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez was waiting for her with a clipboard full of names and a slight smile that suggested yesterday's shooting display had significantly changed his opinion of their new contractor. "Ready to put your money where your mouth is?" he asked. "We've got 20 Marines here who specifically requested to work with you after hearing about yesterday." Sarah looked over the group of Marines waiting near the firing line. These weren't the skeptical, dismissive faces she had encountered the day before. Instead, she saw genuine interest and anticipation. Several Marines nodded respectfully as she made eye contact, and she could sense they were eager to learn what techniques had enabled her impressive shooting performance. "What's the plan for today's session?" Sarah asked Rodriguez. "We figured you could work with small groups, maybe 4 or 5 Marines at a time," he replied. "Focus on whatever you think will help them improve their long-range accuracy. These are all Marines who passed their basic qualification, but want to get better." Sarah spent the first few minutes observing the Marines as they prepared their rifles and equipment. She could already see several areas where small adjustments might yield significant improvements. Many of the Marines were rushing through their pre-shooting routine, not taking time to properly adjust their equipment or confirm their shooting position was optimal. "Before we start shooting," Sarah announced to the first group, "I want to talk about preparation. The shooting you saw yesterday didn't start when I pulled the trigger. It started with how I set up my position and prepared my equipment." She demonstrated the systematic approach she used to establish a shooting position, showing how small adjustments in body positioning could dramatically affect accuracy. The Marines watched intently as she explained how to achieve a natural point of aim that would minimize the muscular tension that could throw off their shots. Private First Class Johnson, a young Marine from Texas, raised his hand. "Ma'am, we've been taught to get into position and start shooting quickly. Won't all this setup take too much time in a real situation?" It was a good question, and Sarah could see the other Marines nodding in agreement. They had been trained to prioritize speed over precision, which made sense for many combat situations, but was limiting their accuracy potential. "You're absolutely right that speed matters in combat," Sarah replied. "But think about it this way. If you can't hit your target, how fast you shoot doesn't matter. These techniques will eventually become automatic, so you'll be able to set up properly without thinking about it." She had the Marines practice the position setup repeatedly, timing them as they worked to develop muscle memory for the correct procedures. Initially, the process was slow and deliberate, but Sarah could see that with practice, the Marines would be able to achieve proper positioning much more quickly. The first live-fire exercise focused on 200-yard targets, a distance where the Marines could see clear results from applying the new techniques. Sarah worked with each Marine individually, making small corrections to their breathing, sight alignment, and trigger control. Corporal Williams, a squad leader from North Carolina, was struggling with inconsistent shot placement. Sarah watched him fire several rounds, then knelt beside him to observe his technique more closely. "Your fundamentals look good," she told him, "but I notice you're not following through consistently after each shot. You're immediately lifting your head to see where the bullet hit, which is disrupting your shooting platform." Sarah demonstrated the proper follow-through technique, showing how maintaining the shooting position for a moment after firing helped ensure the rifle remained stable during the bullet's flight. It was a subtle point, but one that could significantly affect accuracy at longer ranges. Williams tried the technique on his next few shots, and the improvement was immediately visible. His shot group tightened considerably, and he looked up at Sarah with surprise and appreciation. "I've been shooting the same way for 3 years," he said. "Never realized that little movement was throwing off my accuracy." As the morning session progressed, Sarah worked with each Marine on their specific areas for improvement. Some needed help with breathing control, others with sight alignment, and a few required adjustments to their shooting stance. What impressed her most was how eager the Marines were to learn and how quickly they adapted to the new techniques. During a break between shooting strings, Private Martinez approached Sarah with a thoughtful expression. "Ma'am, yesterday when Corporal Blake challenged you to shoot, some of us were hoping you'd fail. Not because we disliked you, but because we didn't want to admit that someone from outside could do better than Marines." Sarah appreciated the honesty. "What changed your mind?" "Watching you work with us today," Martinez replied. "You're not trying to show us up or prove you're better. You're actually trying to help us improve. That makes a big difference." The afternoon session focused on 300-yard shooting, where the benefits of proper technique became even more apparent. Marines who had been struggling to hit targets consistently at this distance were now achieving much better results. The improvement wasn't dramatic overnight, but it was definitely noticeable and encouraging. Sarah introduced more advanced techniques during the afternoon, including how to read wind conditions and adjust for atmospheric factors that affected bullet flight. These were skills that went beyond basic marksmanship, moving into the realm of precision shooting that had been central to her SEAL training. Sergeant Chun, one of the Marine instructors, observed the entire session and approached Sarah as they were cleaning up for the day. "I have to admit, I was skeptical about having a civilian contractor teach marksmanship," she said. "But your approach is really working. The Marines are responding well, and I can see measurable improvement already." "The fundamentals are the same regardless of who's teaching them," Sarah replied. "The key is helping each Marine understand how to apply them consistently." As word continued to spread about the effectiveness of Sarah's instruction, she found herself dealing with a new challenge. Demand for her services was far exceeding the time available. Rodriguez approached her with requests from multiple units wanting their Marines to work with the new shooting instructor. "We've got company commanders asking when their Marines can get training with you," he said. "I've never seen this level of interest in marksmanship improvement. Usually, Marines just want to qualify and move on to other training." Sarah was flattered by the response, but she also recognized the importance of managing expectations. "We need to be realistic about what can be accomplished," she told Rodriguez. "Real improvement takes time and practice. I can teach the techniques, but the Marines have to put in the work to master them." Over the following week, Sarah established a regular training schedule that allowed her to work with different groups of Marines while also observing ongoing qualification sessions. She began to see patterns in the common mistakes that were limiting Marine marksmanship performance, and she developed standardized instruction modules that could address these issues systematically. One of the most significant breakthroughs came when she started working with Marines who had previously failed their shooting qualification. These were often Marines who had developed bad habits or who lacked confidence in their shooting ability. Sarah's patient, systematic approach proved especially effective with this group. Lance Corporal Davis had failed his qualification twice and was facing potential disciplinary action if he didn't pass on his third attempt. He was clearly nervous when he arrived for individual instruction with Sarah, and she could see that his anxiety was part of the problem. "Tell me about your previous qualification attempts," Sarah said, focusing on understanding what had gone wrong rather than immediately jumping into technique correction. Davis explained that he had become increasingly nervous as the shooting distances increased, leading to rushed shots and poor fundamentals. The more he missed, the more anxious he became, creating a negative cycle that undermined his performance. Sarah spent most of the session working on Davis's confidence rather than his shooting technique. She had him start with very close targets where success was almost guaranteed, then gradually increase the distance as his confidence improved. By the end of the session, he was hitting targets at 300 yards consistently. "The key is trusting the process," Sarah told him. "When you start to feel rushed or nervous, go back to the fundamentals. Breathing, sight alignment, trigger control. Do those things right, and the hits will come." Davis's successful qualification the following week became a source of pride not just for him, but for the entire marksmanship program. Other Marines who had been struggling with their shooting began requesting individual instruction, recognizing that Sarah's methods could help them overcome their specific challenges. The success stories began accumulating rapidly. Marines who had been consistently scoring at the lower end of qualification standards were now achieving expert ratings. More importantly, their confidence in their shooting ability was improving, which had positive effects on their overall military performance. Corporal Blake, who had initially challenged Sarah's credentials, became one of her strongest supporters. He approached her one afternoon with what appeared to be a mixture of embarrassment and respect. "I owe you an apology," he said. "When you first arrived, I thought you were just another contractor trying to justify her contract. I was wrong. What you're doing here is really making a difference for these Marines." Sarah appreciated the acknowledgement, but she was more interested in the practical implications. "What matters is that the Marines are improving," she replied. "That's why we're all here." The transformation at Camp Pendleton's shooting range was becoming evident in multiple ways. Qualification scores were improving across the board, Marines were requesting additional practice time, and the overall attitude toward marksmanship training had shifted from something to endure to something to excel at. Rodriguez pulled Sarah aside one afternoon with news that the base commander had taken notice of the improvements. "Colonel Morrison wants to see the qualification statistics from before and after you arrived," he said. "Word is getting up the chain of command about what's happening here." Sarah felt a mixture of pride and concern about the high-level attention. While she was pleased that her work was being recognized, she also knew that increased visibility could bring additional pressure and expectations that might be difficult to meet. "The important thing is maintaining the quality of instruction," she told Rodriguez. "If we start rushing Marines through training just to impress the brass, we'll undermine everything we've accomplished." As her first month at Camp Pendleton neared its end, Sarah reflected on how much had changed since her arrival. The skeptical faces that had greeted her initially had been replaced by Marines who actively sought out her instruction. The casual dismissal of her techniques had evolved into genuine respect for her methods and results. However, she also recognized that her success was creating new challenges. The demand for her instruction was growing faster than she could accommodate, and there was pressure to expand the program in ways that might dilute its effectiveness. The real test would come when she had to prove that her methods could work not just with motivated Marines who specifically requested her instruction, but with the broader population of Marines who were simply required to qualify with their rifles. That challenge was approaching rapidly, as Rodriguez had informed her that she would soon be responsible for running entire qualification courses rather than just providing supplemental instruction. 3 weeks after her successful shooting demonstration, Sarah faced her biggest challenge yet. Colonel Morrison, the base commander, had decided to conduct an official evaluation of the marksmanship program improvements. He announced that a Marine infantry company preparing for deployment would undergo qualification using Sarah's training methods, with their performance compared against historical averages for similar units. The stakes were high. If the evaluation went well, Sarah's contract would likely be extended and her methods might be adopted across other Marine bases. If it went poorly, her time at Camp Pendleton would probably come to an abrupt end, and The Marines who had begun to trust her techniques might lose faith in approaches that differed from traditional Marine training. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez briefed Sarah on the company that would be participating in the evaluation. "This is Charlie Company, 2nd Battalion," he explained. "They're scheduled to deploy to the Middle East in 8 weeks, so their marksmanship qualification isn't just about meeting standards. It could literally be a matter of life and death." The company commander, Captain Jennifer Walsh, was a no-nonsense officer who had heard about Sarah's work but remained skeptical about changing established training methods so close to deployment. When she met with Sarah to discuss the evaluation format, her concerns were evident. "My Marines have been training with standard Marine Corps methods for months," Walsh said. "I'm not comfortable with making major changes to their shooting techniques right before they deploy into a combat zone." Sarah understood the captain's position. Military leaders were naturally conservative when it came to modifying proven procedures, especially when the lives of their personnel might depend on those procedures working correctly under stress. "I'm not suggesting we abandon Marine Corps fundamentals," Sarah replied. "What I'm proposing are refinements that build on existing training. The goal is to help your Marines shoot more accurately, not to confuse them with completely different approaches." After considerable discussion, they agreed on a compromise evaluation format. Half of Charlie Company would receive traditional qualification training, while the other half would train using Sarah's enhanced methods. Both groups would then participate in the same qualification course, allowing for direct comparison of results. The evaluation would span 2 weeks. The first week would focus on training, with Sarah working intensively with her assigned group of Marines. The second week would feature the actual qualification course, observed by Colonel Morrison and other senior officers who would assess the effectiveness of the different training approaches. Sarah knew this evaluation would be different from her previous work at Camp Pendleton. The Marines she had worked with before had specifically requested her instruction and were motivated to learn new techniques. Charlie Company Marines were being assigned to work with her as part of an official evaluation, which meant she would need to win over Marines who might be skeptical or resistant to change. The first day of training revealed the challenge she was facing. Unlike the eager volunteers she had worked with previously, many of Charlie Company Marines approached the training with obvious reluctance. They had been told their usual instructors weren't good enough, and that a civilian contractor would be teaching them instead. This message, while not accurate, was how some Marines had interpreted the evaluation setup. Gunnery Sergeant Mike Torres, Charlie Company's senior enlisted Marine, made his position clear during the initial briefing. "My Marines have been training hard for this deployment," he said. "They know their weapons, and they know how to shoot. I'm not sure why we need to fix something that isn't broken." Sarah recognized that she needed to address the underlying resistance before she could effectively teach shooting techniques. Some Marines nodded in understanding, while others remained visibly skeptical. Sarah knew she would need to demonstrate the value of her methods quickly and convincingly if she was going to win over this group. She decided to start with a diagnostic shooting session that would allow her to identify specific areas where individual Marines might benefit from technique adjustments. Rather than immediately implementing new methods, she observed each Marine's existing shooting technique and made notes about potential improvements. What she found was generally solid fundamental marksmanship with room for improvement in several key areas. Many Marines were not taking full advantage of their natural respiratory pause, leading to shots that were fired with suboptimal stability. Others had developed slight inconsistencies in their shooting position that affected their accuracy at longer ranges. The breakthrough came when she started working with Private First Class Anderson, a young Marine from Iowa who had been struggling with his shooting qualification. His basic technique was sound, but Sarah noticed he was fighting his rifle rather than working with it naturally. "Show me how you normally get into your shooting position," Sarah instructed. Anderson demonstrated his standard approach, which involved forcing his body into what he thought was the correct position rather than finding a natural stance that worked with his individual body type and proportions. "Try this instead," Sarah said, showing him how to adjust his position to work with his natural point of aim rather than fighting against it. The improvement was immediate and dramatic. Anderson's next 5 shots produced a tight group near the center of the target, far better than his usual performance. More importantly, other Marines in the group had watched the demonstration and could see the practical benefit of the adjustment. That's the same technique you used in your shooting demo, isn't it? Asked Corporal Stevens, a squad leader who had been observing the instruction. It's one of several techniques that can help improve consistency, Sarah replied. The key is finding what works best for each individual Marine. Word of Anderson's improvement spread quickly through the company, and Sarah noticed a shift in attitude among the Marines assigned to her group. The skepticism was still there, but it was now mixed with genuine curiosity about what other techniques might help them improve their shooting. Over the following days, Sarah worked systematically through her group of Marines, identifying and addressing individual areas for improvement. The process was time-consuming, requiring her to observe each Marine carefully and provide personalized instruction, but the results were encouraging. Lance Corporal Williams had been struggling with consistency at 300-yard targets. Sarah noticed that his breathing rhythm was irregular, causing him to rush some shots while over-aiming others. After working on controlled breathing techniques, his accuracy improved significantly. Staff Sergeant Jackson, an experienced Marine who initially resisted the new training, was having issues with trigger control that were affecting his precision. Sarah's instruction helped him identify and correct a slight jerking motion that had been pulling his shots off target. The most dramatic improvement came from Corporal Davis, a Marine who had always been an adequate shooter but never excelled at marksmanship. Sarah worked with him on advanced sight alignment techniques and helped him develop a more systematic approach to long-range shooting. By the end of the training week, he was consistently hitting targets that had previously been challenging for him. As the training week progressed, Sarah could see the confidence level increasing among her group of Marines. They were experiencing measurable improvement in their shooting performance, and, more importantly, they were beginning to understand the principles behind the techniques rather than just following instructions blindly. The other half of Charlie Company, meanwhile, was receiving intensive training using traditional Marine Corps methods. Their instructors were experienced and competent, and the Marines in that group were also showing improvement through focused practice and attention to fundamentals. Captain Walsh observed both training groups regularly, taking notes on the different approaches and monitoring the Marines' responses. Sarah could tell the captain was genuinely interested in determining which methods would best serve her Marines during their upcoming deployment. "Your Marines seem to be responding well to the training," Walsh told Sarah during one of her observation visits. "I'm curious to see how they perform during the actual qualification." The qualification week began with all of Charlie Company shooting the same course under identical conditions. The range was set up with targets at 200, 300, and 500 yards, with each Marine firing from multiple positions including prone, sitting, and standing. The scoring would be completely objective, with electronic targets providing precise measurement of each shot's placement. Colonel Morrison arrived for the qualification along with several other senior officers and the commanding general's representative. The level of attention made it clear that the results of this evaluation would have implications well beyond Charlie Company's deployment preparation. Sarah watched nervously as her Marines began their qualification. All of her training and instruction would be meaningless if they couldn't perform when it mattered. The Marines she had worked with seemed confident, but qualification pressure could affect anyone's performance. The first phase of qualification involved 200-yard shooting from the prone position. This was generally the easiest portion of the course, where most Marines achieved good scores regardless of their training methods. As expected, both groups performed well, with only minor differences in their average scores. The 300-yard phase began to show more significant differences. The Marines who had trained with Sarah's methods demonstrated notably better consistency in their shot placement. Their average scores were higher, but, more importantly, fewer Marines were struggling with shots that missed the target entirely. It was during the 500-yard phase that the differences became most apparent. This was the portion of the qualification that typically caused the most difficulty for Marines, and where Sarah's advanced techniques would provide the greatest advantage. Private First Class Anderson, the Marine who had shown such dramatic improvement during training, stepped up to the firing line for his 500-yard shots. Sarah could see he was nervous, but he methodically went through the setup procedures she had taught him. His first shot hit near the center of the target, followed by 9 more shots that produced one of the tightest groups anyone had achieved at that distance. Similar performances were repeated throughout her group of Marines. While not every Marine achieved expert-level shooting, the overall performance was significantly better than the historical averages for similar units. More importantly, Marines who had previously struggled with long-range shooting were now hitting their targets consistently. The Marines who had received traditional training also performed well, achieving scores that were consistent with Marine Corps standards. However, the comparison clearly favored the group that had trained with Sarah's enhanced methods, particularly at the longer ranges where precision shooting techniques provided the greatest benefit. As the qualification concluded, Colonel Morrison approached Sarah with an expression that was difficult to read. She had no idea whether he was pleased with the results or concerned about the implications of adopting non-standard training methods. "Ms. Martinez," he said, "I'd like to discuss these results with you in my office tomorrow morning. Please prepare a briefing on your training methods and your recommendations for implementing them more broadly." Sarah nodded, understanding that the real evaluation was just beginning. The shooting results had demonstrated the effectiveness of her methods, but convincing the Marine Corps to adopt new training approaches would require much more than just good qualification scores. As she watched Charlie Company Marines cleaning their rifles and discussing their qualification performance, Sarah reflected on how far they had all come in just 2 weeks. The skeptical faces that had greeted her at the beginning of the evaluation had been replaced by Marines who were clearly proud of their improved shooting performance. The ultimate test was over, but the most important challenge still lay ahead, convincing the Marine Corps leadership that her methods deserved wider implementation. The next morning, Sarah arrived at Colonel Morrison's office with a comprehensive briefing prepared on her training methods and their implementation. She had spent most of the previous evening analyzing the qualification results and preparing recommendations for how the Marine Corps might incorporate her techniques into their standard marksmanship training program. The colonel's office was filled with senior officers when Sarah arrived. Besides Colonel Morrison, she saw the base training officer, the commanding general's representative, and Captain Walsh from Charlie Company. The level of attendance suggested that her briefing would have implications well beyond Camp Pendleton. "Ms. Martinez," Colonel Morrison began, "the qualification results speak for themselves. Your group of Marines achieved an average score that was 18% higher than the control group, with particularly impressive improvements at longer ranges. What I want to understand is how we might implement these methods across the Marine Corps." Sarah had anticipated this question and had prepared a detailed implementation plan. "The key is understanding that these aren't revolutionary new techniques," she explained. "They're refinements of existing Marine Corps marksmanship fundamentals that can be integrated into current training programs without major disruption." She outlined a phased approach that would begin with training Marine instructors in her enhanced methods, followed by gradual integration into recruit training and ongoing unit preparation. The plan emphasized maintaining Marine Corps standards while adding techniques that would improve overall shooting performance. "What kind of resources would this require?" asked the training officer. Sarah had researched this aspect carefully. "The primary requirement is instructor training time," she replied. "The techniques themselves don't require additional equipment or ammunition. It's mainly a matter of teaching instructors how to identify and correct specific shooting issues that are currently limiting Marine performance." Captain Walsh spoke up with a question that went to the heart of the practical implications. "My Marines are deploying in 6 weeks. Based on what I observed during the evaluation, I want all of them to receive this enhanced training before they leave. Is that possible?" Sarah considered the timeline and the number of Marines involved. "It would be intensive, but yes, it's possible. The key would be focusing on the techniques that provide the greatest benefit in the shortest time." The commanding general's representative had been taking notes throughout the discussion. "Ms. Martinez, what's your assessment of how long it would take to see these improvements reflected in Marine Corps-wide qualification statistics?" "If we focus on training instructors first, we could see measurable improvement within 6 months," Sarah replied. "Full implementation across all Marine units would take longer, probably 18 to 24 months. Colonel Morrison leaned forward with what appeared to be the key question. "Are you prepared to lead this implementation? We're talking about potentially changing how the entire Marine Corps approaches marksmanship training." Sarah felt the weight of the opportunity being presented to her. This was far beyond what she had anticipated when she accepted the contract position at Camp Pendleton. Leading a Marine Corps-wide change in training methods would be a significant career challenge, but also an opportunity to impact thousands of Marines' combat effectiveness. Yes, sir, she replied. I believe these techniques can make a real difference for Marines in combat situations. If the Marine Corps is committed to implementing them properly, I'm prepared to lead that effort. The meeting concluded with Colonel Morrison authorizing an immediate expansion of Sarah's program. Charlie Company would receive complete enhanced marksmanship training before their deployment, and Sarah would begin training Marine instructors who could carry the program to other units. Over the following weeks, Sarah found herself at the center of a significant transformation in Marine Corps marksmanship training. The success of Charlie Company's qualification had generated interest from across the Marine Corps, with requests coming in from multiple bases for information about the enhanced training methods. The intensive training for Charlie Company before their deployment became a showcase for Sarah's techniques. Every Marine in the company received individual instruction, with particular attention paid to those who had previously struggled with shooting qualification. The results were consistently impressive, with company-wide qualification scores reaching levels that exceeded historical records. Captain Walsh became one of Sarah's strongest advocates within the Marine officer community. What Sarah has done for my Marines' confidence and competence is remarkable, she reported to higher headquarters. I feel much better about sending them into combat knowing they can shoot at the level they've achieved. The success stories continued to accumulate. Lance Corporal Davis, who had barely passed his previous qualifications, achieved an expert rating and expressed interest in attending advanced marksmanship schools. Private First Class Anderson requested assignment to his unit's designated marksman program, confident that his improved shooting skills made him a viable candidate. Perhaps most significantly, Gunnery Sergeant Torres, who had initially resisted the enhanced training, became one of its most effective advocates. I've been training Marines for 15 years, he told Sarah. What you've shown us isn't about replacing Marine Corps training. It's about making it better. As word spread throughout the Marine Corps, Sarah began receiving requests to visit other bases and train their instructors. The commanding general approved a temporary duty program that would allow her to travel to multiple installations, spreading the enhanced marksmanship techniques across the service. The first off-base training session took place at Marine Corps Base Quantico, where Sarah worked with instructor trainers who would be responsible for implementing the program at their home bases. The session was intensive, covering not just the shooting techniques, but also the instructional methods needed to teach them effectively. Master Sergeant Williams, a career Marine with over 20 years of service, participated in the Quantico training. I was skeptical about learning new shooting techniques from a civilian, he admitted to Sarah. But after seeing the results and understanding the principles behind your methods, I'm convinced this is going to make our Marines more effective. The program continued to expand rapidly. Within 6 months of the original evaluation, Sarah's enhanced marksmanship techniques were being implemented at Marine bases across the United States. Qualification scores improved significantly wherever the methods were properly implemented, validating the effectiveness of her approach. A year after her arrival at Camp Pendleton, Sarah received notification that Charlie Company had completed their deployment successfully. Captain Walsh's after-action report specifically mentioned the improved marksmanship performance of her Marines and credited the enhanced training with contributing to their mission success. During multiple engagements, my Marines demonstrated exceptional shooting accuracy at ranges that would have been challenging under the old training methods, Walsh reported. The enhanced marksmanship training provided a clear tactical advantage. The formal recognition came when Sarah was invited to speak at the Marine Corps' annual training conference. Her presentation on enhanced marksmanship techniques was attended by senior officers from across the service, including the Commandant of the Marine Corps himself. What a mess. Martinez has accomplished represents the best kind of military innovation, the Commandant noted in his remarks. She identified ways to improve our existing capabilities through systematic analysis and dedicated instruction. This is exactly the kind of thinking we need to maintain our competitive edge. The Marine Corps formally adopted Sarah's enhanced marksmanship techniques as part of their standard training curriculum, making her methods an official part of how Marines learn to shoot. The implementation came with a requirement that all Marine marksmanship instructors complete certification training in the enhanced techniques. Sarah found herself in the unique position of having influenced the training of every Marine who would go through marksmanship qualification in the future. It was a responsibility she didn't take lightly, knowing that the skills she taught might one day save lives in combat situations. 2 years after her initial arrival at Camp Pendleton, Sarah reflected on how much had changed. What began as a contract position teaching shooting techniques had evolved into a career dedicated to improving Marine Corps combat effectiveness. The skeptical faces that had initially greeted her had been replaced by respect and appreciation from Marines at every level. The statistics told the story clearly. Marine Corps-wide qualification scores had improved by an average of 15% since the implementation of her enhanced training methods. More importantly, Marines reported greater confidence in their shooting ability, which translated into improved performance in other areas of their military training. Perhaps the most satisfying feedback came from Marines who had struggled with shooting before receiving the enhanced training. Sarah received dozens of letters from Marines thanking her for helping them achieve qualification standards they had never thought possible. Many of these Marines had gone on to excel in their military careers, with their improved marksmanship serving as a foundation for broader professional success. The program's success led to requests from other military services interested in adopting similar training methods. Sarah found herself working with Army, Navy, and Air Force instructors, helping them adapt her techniques for their specific needs and requirements. Looking back on her transition from active duty SEAL to Marine Corps instructor, Sarah realized that her most significant contribution to military service had come not from her individual performance as an operator, but from her ability to help others achieve their potential. The skills she had developed during her SEAL career had prepared her not just to excel individually, but to pass that excellence on to others. The legacy of her work extended far beyond shooting qualification scores. Sarah had demonstrated that innovation in military training didn't require abandoning proven methods, but rather finding ways to make them more effective. Her success had encouraged other instructors to examine their own teaching methods and look for opportunities to improve. As she prepared for her next assignment, developing advanced marksmanship programs for Marine Special Operations units, Sarah felt confident that her work had made a lasting impact on the Marine Corps. The techniques she had developed were now part of the institutional knowledge that would be passed down through generations of Marine instructors. The Marines who had initially laughed at the idea of learning from a SEAL veteran now served as advocates for her methods, spreading the enhanced training techniques throughout the Corps. Her demonstration that first day had proven her individual capabilities, but her real achievement was building a program that would continue improving Marine marksmanship long after she moved on to other challenges. The rifle that had earned her initial skepticism had become the tool through which she transformed how an entire military service approached one of its most fundamental skills. In proving herself to those doubting Marines, Sarah had discovered her true calling as a teacher and innovator whose impact would be measured not in her own achievements, but in the success of the thousands of Marines she helped train.